First, I'd like to welcome back Lauren DeMar, Ipsos's Chief Growth Officer. Lauren, over to you, please.
Thank you, Ellen. Hi again, everybody. So we have taken quite a journey together today, and I'm hoping that along that journey, you had a few aha moments, you got some new ideas, and you learned a few things. So before we do a recap, actually, what I want to do is take a look at what you all told us that you think are the top trends in food today. So here are the results of the survey that you took earlier. And actually, I would say it's kind of a really good reflection of what we've been talking about all day today. So either you guys are clairvoyant if you completed the survey this morning, or you're really fantastic listeners if you completed the survey at lunchtime. Either way, you get an A. We can see lots of themes around health and sourcing, healthy, sustainability, local, plant-based, organic. Delivery also came through as a trend. Ethnic, reflecting the diversification of America, was mentioned as well. So great job, everybody. Let's move on and just recap quickly the journey that we took together today. So we started by taking a look at some of the global trends. Actually, this ended up being section 2, but let me just recap that are impacting the food industry. So we talked about societal change. This was Cliff's presentation, specifically aging population. People are having fewer kids, increasing racial and ethnic diversity. These are impacting demand and consumption right now. People have a declining trust in institutions. That leaves a void that businesses and brands can fill. And then, of course, there's the tribalism that is intensifying in America, and that's affecting how people think, how they behave, and which brands they prefer. We had a section on value reframing, which is a very important topic right now. Businesses and brands have an imperative and a right to lead social change. But to do that successfully, brands need to think about purpose in the context of me, my world, and the world, meaning having a purpose that delivers benefits beyond the moment, not just in the moment, and then communicate that authentically to empower people to make the easy choice for themselves. And also, to be successful means closing that say-do gap, but you have to close the do first. You have to deliver on the do before you say anything. That is critical. The third stop on the journey was to take a look at consumers' complex relationship with food. 3 pieces of advice were given here. So understanding where consumers are on their emotional journey, you want to meet them where they are now. As you develop your innovation plans, try to capitalize on emerging consumer needs for immune health and mental well-being benefits. And then finally, understand and deliver on the emotional needs that consumers have today, while envisioning how you might drive new habits and behaviors that will endure tomorrow. And here we talked about our behavioral science habits framework and how to make behaviors sticky. We then talked about creating and converting desire for food, because our relationships with food are very emotional. Yes, you should prioritize addressing emerging consumer needs around health and immunity, of course, but recognize that the whole dynamic of cooking, sharing, and eating satisfies deep emotional needs as well. So understanding those psychological foundations is at the root of how to harness that opportunity within the food industry. And then finally, how you activate touch points. We talked about the decision journey and the touch points along that journey, be they menus, advertising, in-store or e-commerce touch points. Those are key to transforming that desire for food into purchase and then into consumption. Desire is system 1, and to capitalize on that, you want to leverage behavioral science principles to innovate, to communicate, and then ultimately to sell your product. And how food is consumed is evolving. You need to know your consumer target in context so you can win occasions today, and so you can design products that will enable you to keep your consumers tomorrow. And now more than ever, you need to understand that evolving granular segmentation driven by a more fragmented America with different beliefs and state-by-state restrictions impacting behavior. You should be planning for multiple scenarios. We talked about that being able to pivot with agility so you can capture a greater share of meal occasions and drive success during the upcoming holiday season. And of course, just as COVID-19 surprised us by completely disrupting the industry, and now we know this can happen almost overnight, you want to continue to keep an eye on disruptions so you can anticipate and ultimately profit from changes to come. So we talked about aggregated, hyper-localized, and curated consumption. Very cool concepts. Is your business anticipating these? The final stop on our journey was a provocative discussion on the future of food with our panel of experts. We had guests, Jeff, Julia, and RJ, and our very own Claire and Oscar. I want to thank all of our panelists very much for joining us. So Jeff talked about the changes he's seeing. He talked about the newfound trust in CPG brands and also the opportunity to introduce your brand story to a whole new group of consumers. That was a great point. I absolutely love that. COVID-19 put a spotlight on the supply chain and the need for change, like sourcing and direct-to-consumer, among others. E-commerce is here to stay. Jeff spoke about that. RJ spoke about that. Big theme, the implications for how brands are discovered, as well as how to pivot quickly to satisfy peaks in demand. That was another topic RJ brought up as well. And then Jeff talked about the need for regulation at scale. I really hope that Jeff is lobbying the government, or better yet, that he's going to run for office, because he raised a lot of good points in that category. Julia pointed out that we're shopping less, but that we're buying more on each trip. And she also talked about trust and how this has bolstered the benefit side of the value equation, at least for now, and the importance of understanding specific targets and the benefits that they're willing to pay more for. RJ's and Claire's comments on the restaurant industry were concerning to me, because I'm a very heavy user, but they unfortunately make sense. The industry probably will contract. I hope that they do rethink their business models, like more drive-throughs, more delivery options. I also agree very much with Claire's comments about restaurants delivering an experience as well as an avenue for socialization. Those are benefits that are not going away. So there's a pocket there for growth, going back to my earlier analogy about finding the pockets. So again, thank you to all of our panel guests for taking the time to join us today and for sharing your views with us. So just one last comment here, because to me, a journey would not be complete without a destination. So here's what it all comes down to for me. I started off by talking about that pendulum swinging between more over to eat to live these days, or food as sustenance. We're in a crisis. We have to get through it. We need to thrive. But we're human beings and we're resilient. And the live to eat mentality, or food as enjoyment and even entertainment, as a satisfier of higher end social needs, it's going to return. The key will be to balance those two sides of the pendulum, providing people with food enjoyment as well as satisfying their needs for sustenance, both in the moment as well as beyond the moment, by delivering a brand purpose that resonates with people in an authentic way, be that food waste, sustainability, or diversity and inclusion. COVID-19 has jarred people out of their habits around food. It's taken them off autopilot, and the food industry can capitalize on this. There are pockets of growth opportunities, and there's money in the pockets. It's important to prepare for multiple eventualities in this uncertain world that we're living in. Have your finger on the pulse and stay close to your consumers. Remember, knowledge is currency now more than ever. Have plans ready to go against multiple future scenarios and be able to pivot quickly. And now for something completely different. If you're like me, you're fascinated by this election cycle. You're wondering how it's all going to play out. So it is my pleasure to introduce Chris Jackson, a seasoned political pollster, Senior Vice President of Ipsos's political polling team. Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Lauren. So after this feast of a day focusing on all of this different fascinating data and research and thought about food, now for the decadent after dinner cocktail to talk a little bit about the election. And this is probably the most important election of our lifetime. And every election cycle we say that, but just think about it for a second. In 2020, we have experienced the greatest global pandemic in over 100 years, the greatest economic downturn in about 90 years, and the greatest social unrest in the last 60 years. So this is a watershed moment. This year is a watershed moment. In the midst of all of that, we are going into a presidential election. that I think is going to be fascinating and is going to be a bit of a wild ride. And I'm going to take you through some of our data about what we're seeing right now and what we expect to see in the next 3 months. So first off, let's just jump right into the ballot. This is our most recent polling from our Reuters Ipsos poll, where we track on a weekly basis where the country is. And this is where the country is right now, not necessarily where it's going to be in 3 months on election day. But at least as of right now, we see Joe Biden, the Democratic challenger, has a relatively substantial advantage over Donald Trump, the incumbent president. He's leading by about 6 points with all Americans. He's leading by about 10 points with registered voters. But you can see that the split is really very partisan. Democrats are almost entirely unified behind Biden. Republicans almost entirely behind Trump. And the real difference this cycle is independent voters. And I'll come back to this in a minute. But at least at this moment, independent voters look to be a little bit more supportive of Biden than Trump, and that's making the difference. The other thing that's making the difference is how Americans are viewing the main issues facing the country right now. We talked a little bit earlier today about what the main issues facing the world are. And if we ask the public, what are the issues facing you that are driving how you decide you're going to vote, right now there are 3. And it is a plan to deal with coronavirus is the number 1 issue by a pretty decent margin. And then the number 2 and 3 issues relatively close together are being able to restore trust in government and being able to get the economy going again. Those 2 aspects, restore trust in the government and get the economy going, are really different facets of the coronavirus pandemic. So really 1, 2, and 3 are all really about the pandemic. And what we're seeing right now is that the president is not being seen as doing a terribly good job on the coronavirus pandemic or on the idea of being able to restore trust in the federal government. Joe Biden is seen as more credible on these 2 topics by the majority or the plurality rather of people. The only place where the president is on somewhat stronger terrain is when we look at the economy. And that's why we constantly see the White House trying to pivot back to focusing on the economy, trying to get past the coronavirus disease to look at the economy, because people, generally speaking, trust the president more on the economy. And if the White House is able to shift the agenda to focusing back on the economy, it puts them in a stronger place. But as long as the focus of the country is on the pandemic, it's on the number of cases and the number of deaths and all of the dislocation that we've been talking about today, that's terrain that is more hospitable for Joe Biden. And then also, whenever it's the conversation is talking about how the government could and should be doing more to deal with the pandemic, that's also terrain that's hospitable to Joe Biden, potentially because President Trump's response to the coronavirus is not being seen as being very strong or very assertive, and that the public is actually looking for a stronger response right now, and Biden is seen as stronger on those 2 aspects. But the thing to remember is that it's not a national election, right? In 2016, the poll said that Hillary Clinton would win with 3% lead, and then she ended up not winning. But the truth is, in 2016, she actually got 2 percentage points, a little over 2 percentage points more of the popular vote than Donald Trump. But Donald Trump won enough of the key swing states to win in the Electoral College, right? So let's throw that national poll data that I just introduced to you out the window. Biden's 6 or 10 point advantage, while substantial, doesn't necessarily matter if he's not able to win 270 electoral college votes in the essential states. So what do we see right now in those swing states? Well, the map actually right now looks pretty solid for Biden. But again, that's right now. That doesn't necessarily mean things aren't going to change over the next 3 months. But right now, Biden is actually doing well in those upper Midwestern states that Hillary Clinton sort of surprisingly lost in 2016 of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. He's also doing relatively well in Florida, which is another state that Trump won in 2016. And the battleground has actually expanded to some Republican states like Georgia or Texas or Ohio that have been pretty solidly Republican for the last couple of election cycles. We've seen Joe Biden start to spend money in Texas Joe Biden's campaign director, actually was a campaign director for Beto O'Rourke in Texas, so she knows the state really well. So it looks like they think that that is a legitimate battleground state. Again, we'll see over the next 3 months. But even putting that aside, the race is going to remain very competitive because Trump's popularity in a lot of these swing states is actually stronger than it is in the nation as a whole. His overall approval rating across the country is about 41% of Americans think he's doing a good job. But in a lot of these swing states like Michigan or Wisconsin or Ohio, his approval rating is actually 45, 46, 47%. It's not a lot, but it's enough to make a difference, and it's going to make those states close. And if the coronavirus pandemic appears to be coming under control over the next 3 months, we fully expect the polls to close for this to get to become a more competitive election, and for this to become much like we've seen the last couple of elections, the kind of thing that really comes down to the wire. The other thing to keep in mind about that coming down to the wire thing is in 2016, 45% of the vote was cast early or absentee. We think that's going to be higher this year. We think more than half of the vote is going to be cast before we get to Election Day. So it's going to be a really interesting dynamic in that, if there's an October surprise, some big event that comes into the election cycle, it shakes everything up. Depending on what time it happens, it may not actually affect a lot of the vote, right? Because half the vote may have already been cast by the time we get to that last weekend before the election. So if there's some big announcement, Trump announces that there's a vaccine that's been produced or something, a lot of the vote's already been cast. It's not going to affect it, right? So it's going to be a very interesting cycle to understand that interplay between early voting and then what's happening in the news cycle, what's happening with the coronavirus pandemic. It's going to be a very complex environment. So to get back to the point I made earlier about independent voters, one of the other big differences from this year, from 2016, is what we're seeing happening with undecided voters. In 2016, undecided voters, that is voters who didn't support either Clinton or Trump when asked in polls, people who made up their minds at the last minute, people who actually, in many cases, didn't like either candidate, broke for Trump in large margins in the last week of the campaign. And that was enough to close the polls and to put Trump over the top in a lot of those close swing states. Post-election analysis in 2016 suggests that Trump gained between 1 and 3 percentage points in the final vote because of these late-breaking undecided voters, which was enough to give him the margin he needed in those 3 upper Midwestern states of Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, where he only won by a total of about 80,000 votes. But this year, we're not really seeing that happening in the same way. What we're seeing this year is that undecided voters have a very negative view of the president. Their approval of his job performance is actually only in the 20s. They think the country's going in the wrong direction by huge margins. It's like only about 10% of them think the country's going in the right direction. And if push comes to shove, most of them say they would support Joe Biden over Donald Trump. And what that says to us is that Trump doesn't really have this reservoir of potential vote that can swing to him in the last minute, like he did in 2016, which suggests that even as we move forward in the polls, and maybe the polls close a little bit because some of the president's disaffected supporters come back to him, we won't necessarily see a big 3-point swing towards him in the last week of the campaign. Again, that's as of right now. Things could change, rolling out a coronavirus vaccine, actually getting access to it for millions of Americans might be the kind of thing that swings undecided voters' opinions because they are by definition not fixed. But that is one of the key differences, because in 2016, when we did this analysis, we saw even in the summer, even in July of 2016, that these undecided voters looked like they were actually more likely to be Trump voters than they were Clinton voters. As we look down through the rest of the election, because remember, president actually isn't the only thing on the ballot. Democrats also have an advantage in Congress right now. This chart in front of you shows the generic congressional ballot and then the generic Senate ballot on the top and the bottom. Among registered voters, Democrats have a 6-point advantage for Congress and have a 8-point advantage for the Senate. That doesn't necessarily break down to a specific number of seats or wins. But sort of if we take that all together, what we believe is right now the Democrats control the House of Representatives. We think the odds are that they'll maintain control of the House of Representatives after the election. The Senate, though, we think is a toss-up. Right now, Republicans control the Senate by a few seats. However, the way the map is shaping up this cycle, it looks like there are enough competitive seats that Democrats have good chances in, that this Senate could go either way, could be Republican controlled or Democratic controlled, could even break 50-50, and the tie-breaking vote goes to the vice president, which then, of course, becomes a matter of who wins the presidency again. So as I finish sort of the presentation here, I want to start thinking a little bit more about the future and what the election has in store, particularly for food. There's really sort of three options on the table, three sort of general scenarios that we expect to see coming out of the election. So the ones that are the most likely are a narrow win for Joe Biden or a narrow win for Donald Trump. That is, they win by a few percentage points. Maybe it comes down to 80,000 votes like it did in 2016 again. If there is a narrow Biden win, of course, Democrats take the White House. They hold control of the House of Representatives. Republicans control the Senate. And what we'll see coming out of that is a little bit of the sort of gridlock that we witnessed in the latter part of the Obama era. There'll be certainly some fitful efforts to control the pandemic and do stimulus spending to get the economy going. The executive branch will certainly work to reconstitute the regulatory apparatus, but they aren't necessarily going to be empowered to do a lot of new stuff. And the private sector is really going to have a lot of freedom to kind of do what the private sector sort of wants, because Congress is going to be sort of gridlocked between the Republican Senate and the Democratic House and White House. If, on the other hand, Donald Trump wins in a narrow election, we still expect the Democrats to control the House, Republicans to control the Senate. But the White House, the executive branch, will continue to be controlled by President Trump and the Republican Party. And what we expect out of that is more of sort of what we've witnessed for the last 4 years, where major policy set really sort of at sort of what's based on sort of Donald Trump's personal inclinations at that moment. There's not necessarily a huge through line you can tie around it. We'll probably see continued sort of restrictionist trade, a lot more bilateral versus multilateral international deals, and a lot more sort of domestic unrest as Democrats and Republicans continue sort of going at each other with about the president and the president's sort of many issues. I think that the big sort of risk coming out of this actually is that the president also has an inclination to single out specific companies, to either lionize in a positive way or to demonize in a negative way. And there's going to be a lot of pressure, particularly from the left, for companies to engage in social activism as they've been essentially locked out of control of government, which is again going to create a very conflict-driven social space to navigate. The other alternative that we see potentially coming out of this is a blue wave election. That is, Democrats make huge gains. They win the White House by a large margin. They take control of the Senate. They keep control of the House of Representatives. If that happens, we expect to see a very sort of emboldened progressive control of government. So they will spend a lot of effort and money to get the coronavirus under control and to get the economy going. And if they have control of the government, they'll be able to do a lot of that. There'll be a very proactive regulatory state established to sort of monitor and govern all aspects of capitalism. But we'll also probably see a lot of government expenditure in a lot of new areas, like creating a green economy. And it's a place where good companies will have the opportunity to lead, because Joe Biden is not a socialist. He's not from the liberal wing of the Democratic Party. He is, for all intents and purposes, sort of a centrist. He is very much from the sort of new Democratic mold, which has really fallen by the wayside of being someone who likes to try to bring together both the private sector and sort of social organizations or social goods. So businesses, private sector organizations that have a positive, good reputation will have a lot of ability to help set the agenda. And as was mentioned in the last session, right now, the private sector has a stronger reputation than the government does. So you will be positioned in a place to help really guide sort of what the future looks like. And there'll be a lot of opportunities to sort of tap into this sort of massive government expenditure. Because remember, this 2020 is a epical change moment. And this could be like the moment when FDR essentially released like the Works Product Administration and all the rest of sort of the New Deal that really transformed the face of American society. And if there's a blue wave, that's kind of what we anticipate happening. That's not our most likely outcome. We think the most likely outcome is probably the narrow Biden win, but that is certainly on the table as one of the ranges of possibilities. So to finish off here, we have some key takeaways for the day. Number one, it's important to engage with consumers by understanding the context of their daily life circumstances. I think right now, during the coronavirus pandemic, during this sort of political crazy season, it's important to understand that consumers aren't necessarily just consumers, they're citizens as well, they're people as well. They have a lot of pressures and tensions on their life. And increasingly, we're seeing all of these different sort of attributes of people's lives coming into alignment with each other. And it's important to always keep that in mind as you're thinking about how do you work with your consumers, is you're not just providing them with the product anymore, providing them with the service anymore. Consumers are really demanding a much more wide-ranging relationship with companies, with organizations in the private sector. And you have to keep those in mind as you're operating. Enable your organization to quickly activate and deploy disruptive business models. As I mentioned, this is a change moment in history. This is potentially an inflection point in American or world history. And the businesses that are able to rapidly innovate and adapt are the ones that are going to survive and potentially thrive. Execute plans with a focus on agility and flexibility and strategies and tactics. Much like the last one, this is going to be an environment where, you may not even get it right the first time, but it's about sort of being able to adapt. It's about being able to sort of understand your consumers and about being an agile organization and learn and adapt and learn and adapt and just keep doing that cycle again, because we're not done with this change that we're seeing to society. We're really at the midpoint of it. Like the last session talked about, we don't necessarily know how things are going to emerge from this. We don't know if people are going to return back to in-restaurant dining, or if there's going to be some interesting new hybrid of people getting takeout and then picnicking outside, or some other version of that. And as we get through this cycle, as we get through this change, the organizations that are able to do that are going to be important. And then finally, evolve brands to lead social change, selecting platforms that are authentic and activated with intention. As I said, the federal government, the sort of the formal public institutions are not very trusted right now. The private sector actually has a lot more trust in a lot of ways. However, there's a lot of demand amongst the public for the private sector to step into those gaps that the public sector has failed on, right? So you're seeing that push in the private sector for private sector organizations to lead on things like climate change, to lead on things like social justice. And a lot of that's because the government has been seen not to have done it. It's also as people are recognizing that these organizations have the power to make these changes, they're demanding that this be done so. All right, I think that's it.